In the late 1980s, Sony quietly built one of the most interesting computers you've probably never heard of. It wasn't a Walkman, it wasn't a Trinitron, and it definitely wasn't a PlayStation. It was a Unix workstation line called Sony News, short for Network Engineering Workstation, later marketed as Network Station. These machines were fast, network-centric Unix boxes meant to sit on a researcher's desk and stand in for the digital VAX and other mini-computers that ruled labs at the time. In Japan, they became a common sight in universities and R&D centers. Outside Japan, they're almost invisible in the historical record. Yet tucked inside the story of Sony News are some surprising threads. An internal rebellion inside Sony's engineering ranks, a bet on BSD Unix in a world that still assumed IBM and AT&T would set the rules, and a direct link to the tools that built early Super Nintendo games and even the first generation of PlayStation titles. This is the story of how a consumer electronics giant accidentally became a serious Unix workstation vendor, and what's left of that legacy today. To understand why Sony News happened at all, you have to wind back to the early 1980s, when Sony was experimenting along the edges of the computer market. Long before it shipped Unix workstations, Sony sold more modest office and home machines built around the Zilog Z80 processor. The SMC-70, introduced in the early 1980s, was aimed at business and office automation. It ran a proprietary Sony operating system, booted from floppy disks, and was meant to be a compact, reliable box for word processing and simple data tasks, very much in line with Japan's OA computer trend of the time. A little later came the SMC-777, still Z80-based, but more home and education-oriented. One of its most interesting aspects was the promotion of Dr. Logo, an educational programming environment derived from Seymour Papert's Logo language. Sony worked with Digital Research to bring Dr. Logo to the 7077, bundling it alongside BASIC, an assembler, and simple productivity tools. For a consumer electronics company, this was already fairly ambitious. Sony was learning how to build complete computing systems, hardware, operating system, and software ecosystem, years before News appeared. Inside Sony, the push toward News didn't begin as a plan to take on Sun Microsystems or DEC. Project leader Toshitada Doi originally imagined something closer to those earlier Z80 systems, a straightforward 32-bit business machine for office applications, essentially an evolution of Sony's existing office automation products. He assembled a small team inside Sony's MIPS, that's Media Information Products and Systems, business group, and outlined that vision. But the engineers he picked had other ideas. In their daily work, they depended on a limited pool of DEC VAX super mini computers. Those VAX systems ran Unix, and the engineers constantly had to time-share them, even competing with one another for access. Given a chance to design a new machine, they quietly ignored Dewey's brief. Instead of a simple OA-style computer, they set out to build a true Unix workstation, powerful enough to replace those VAX systems on their own desks. It was an unusually bottom-up project for a large Japanese corporation. A team building the machine they wanted to use themselves, and only later worrying about what management had asked for. Once the direction shifted to a Unix workstation, things moved quickly. The News team built a first working prototype in roughly 6 months. By October 1986, Sony was confident enough to formally announce the project, and in January 1987, the first shipping model, the NWS 800 series, reached the Japanese market. Sony reportedly invested about 400 million yen in News development, around $2.7 million at mid-1980s exchange rates. For a workstation platform built essentially by an internal venture team, it was a serious but not extravagant bet. The NWS 800 ran 4.2 BSD Unix on a Motorola 68020 CPU. In performance terms, it could stand alongside the super mini computers it was meant to displace, but its pricing was the real shock. Depending on configuration, a News 800 cost between roughly 950,000 and 2.75 million yen, about 6,500 to 19,000 US dollars in 1987. Comparable Unix workstations from established vendors regularly came in near 10 million yen, or around $69,000. That huge price gap, combined with serious performance, made News instantly attractive to cost-sensitive universities and R&D labs in Japan. Demand was so strong that Sony recouped its entire development investment in just 2 months after launch, an almost unheard-of payback period for a new computer architecture. Under the hood, the team had to make a foundational decision: which flavor of Unix to adopt. Toshitada Doi leaned toward AT&T's System 5, which promised a clearer commercial support path and looked like the official Unix. His engineers, who lived on networked systems every day, favored BSD, the Berkeley software distribution, because of its advanced networking stack and built-in TCP/IP support. For a machine explicitly designed to live on networks rather than in isolation, that networking advantage was decisive. The team ultimately chose BSD, betting that computer networks would be more important than rigid alignment with AT&T's roadmap. The first two generations of News OS, versions 1.x and 2.x introduced in 1987, were based on 4.2 BSD and used Shift-JIS character encoding, tuned for Japanese text. From News OS 3.x in 1988 and 4.x in 1990, Sony moved to a 4.3 BSD base and shifted to EUC, Extended Unix Code, for Japanese, aligning with emerging Unix conventions. Then, in the early 1990s, the pendulum swung back towards System 5. News OS 5.x, introduced in 1992, and 6.x in 1993, were built on System 5 Release 4.2 while maintaining EUC. That transition reflects the changing Unix world of the time, as vendors converged on SVR4 for compatibility, even as they layered their own networking and localization work on top. Sony didn't keep News confined to rarefied research labs. In the same year the NWS 800 launched, 1987, the company introduced a lower-cost variant called PopNEWS, model PWS 1550. Where the original news boxes were unapologetically technical, PopNEWS tried to bring Unix into more ordinary Japanese offices. PopNEWS added a graphical shell called News Desk, intended to hide the Unix command line behind icons and menus. Sony also introduced the Common Document File Format, or CDFF, to make it easier to share documents across applications in a consistent way. The whole system was pitched as a Japanese-language desktop publishing and office document platform. High-quality text, complex layouts, and the kinds of fonts and character handling that typical Western-oriented systems struggled with. For the late 1980s, this was an unusual move. Most Unix workstation vendors focused narrowly on engineering, scientific computing, and CAD. Sony, by contrast, was trying to bridge its consumer and professional businesses, using Unix as the foundation for mainstream publishing and office workflows. Over time, as the news line matured, its strongest commercial niches would indeed become desktop publishing and CAD/CAM, areas where high-resolution displays and powerful graphics mattered more than raw number crunching alone. Physically, Sony news machines had a recognizable look that set them apart from contemporaries from Sun or DEC. Early models used dual 68K series processor configurations. For example, Motorola 68020 or 68030 CPUs running in the 16 to 25 MHz range, arranged so that one processor could handle I/O tasks while the other focused on computation, depending on the model and configuration. Both the 68K and later MIPS-based news machines shared a common case design. The front panel featured a large hinged door that hid a 3.5-inch micro-floppy drive and a 5.25-inch expansion bay, which could hold a SCSI tape drive or CD-ROM. Behind that door were also a recessed reset button and a row of dip switches used to configure low-level boot parameters, a reminder that this was still a machine for system administrators and power users. On the back, users found 3 expansion slots, one normally occupied by the graphics card, plus connectors for SCSI, Ethernet via an AUI port, serial channels, with channel 0 commonly used as a console, a parallel port, and a proprietary keyboard connector. It was a tidy, highly integrated workstation design, with Sony's usual attention to industrial styling layered over a fairly flexible Unix workstation architecture. As the workstation market evolved, Sony gradually moved news from the Motorola 68K line to RISC processors from MIPS. By late 1989, the NWS 3860 arrived as the first news model built around a MIPS R3000 CPU, marking a significant architectural pivot. MIPS offered a cleaner, more easily scalable instruction set, and crucially, it was something Sony could license and manufacture through its own semiconductor arm. The transition didn't happen overnight. Late 1980s models like the NWS 1750, 1830, and 1850 still used 68030 processors, with some configurations offering dual CPU setups and even optical disk drives with erasable cartridges holding just under 600 megabytes. But the momentum was clearly shifting toward RISC. Sony also experimented with portability. In 1991, it released the News 3250, a so-called portable workstation. Weighing around 18 pounds, it had an 11-inch monochrome LCD with an unusually high resolution of 1120 by 780 pixels, a MIPS R3000 at 20 MHz, with an R3010 floating point unit, and up to 36 megabytes of RAM. It ran a System-wide Release 4-based News OS with the Motif graphical environment and sold in the US for around $10,000 to $12,000 depending on disk size. Portable in this context meant you could move it between desks and plug it in. Not exactly a laptop, but it brought Unix workstation power to a wider range of physical spaces. Through the early and mid-1990s, Sony continued pushing News up the performance ladder. Mid-range MIPS models in the 3000 series and 5000 series adopted faster R4000 class and R4400 class processors as those became available, eventually reaching clock speeds up to about 200 MHz on the higher-end configurations. One notable late machine was the NWS 7000 series, introduced around the mid-1990s. A top-spec configuration could carry 4 MIPS R5000 processors running at 200 MHz, offering full 64-bit processing and placing Sony in the same technical conversation as high-end workstations from SGI and other RISC vendors. On paper, it was among the most capable Unix workstations ever shipped by a Japanese manufacturer. Despite that, News never achieved the same global recognition as its American rivals. In the United States, Sun Microsystems dominated the Unix workstation mindshare, and Sony struggled to establish sales and support networks. In Europe, too, News remained a rarity, appearing mostly in institutions that had specific ties to Japan or niche technical needs that fit Sony's hardware particularly well. For many people, the most intriguing part of the News story is its quiet influence on game development. When Sony's PlayStation project moved from concept to reality in the early 1990s, the company needed development hardware long before a consumer console existed. The solution was to adapt what it already had: Sony News Workstations. Early PlayStation development kits consisted of modified News machines, augmented with prototype PlayStation hardware on add-in boards. Developers wrote code and assets under News OS, then ran and tested them on the attached console logic. This let Sony's internal teams and early third-party studios start building games while the console hardware and operating system were still in flux. Nintendo, meanwhile, used Sony News systems as part of its development environment for Super Nintendo Entertainment System titles. Several high-profile first-party NES games were created with toolchains that ran on News workstations. The exact details differ between sources, and not every step of those pipelines is well documented. But the broad outline is clear. In the early 1990s, if you were building cutting-edge console games for Nintendo or Sony, there was a good chance a Sony Unix workstation was somewhere in the process. By the late 1990s, the world around Sony News had changed. Commodity PCs running Windows NT and later Linux were eroding the market for proprietary Unix workstations from all vendors. In networking and server roles, generic x86 hardware was increasingly good enough, and specialized RISC systems became harder to justify outside certain high-end niches. Sony's News division was dissolved in 1998, ending a roughly decade-long run. The hardware never gained substantial footholds in North America or Europe, so even at their peak, News machines remained primarily a Japanese phenomenon. Some units saw later life in video-on-demand systems and as early internet servers, but they gradually disappeared from day-to-day use. Today, surviving News hardware is rare and often expensive on the collector market. Emulation projects like MAME have made some progress. Several 68K-based and early MIPS models can be emulated well enough to run News OS through version 4.x, Later, System V-based releases, especially News OS 5.x and 6.x, are much less documented. It's still unclear whether full emulation of those systems is practical with the information currently available. Even so, the legacy of Sony News is larger than its sales numbers. It represents a moment when a consumer electronics giant let a small team of engineers build the Unix workstation they wanted, and in doing so, created a platform that quietly underpinned parts of Japan's research infrastructure and the early years of modern console game development. For a forgotten workstation line, that's not a bad afterlife.